Hi, I'm Steve Palumbi, and this is the Science of the Extreme Life for the Sea. And today we're going to talk about the strangest family lives in the ocean, the way ocean creatures reproduce, how that differs from the way that typical animals reproduce on land, and the kind of evolutionary strategies that different reproductive strategies are built from. And I want to start with one of the most commonly odd reproductive tactics in the ocean, and that's males giving birth in seahorses. Pretty commonly known that unlike most animals on land or in the ocean, it isn't females that give birth in seahorses, but it is the males. This shows a typical progression of that. First, there's a mating interaction, sort of a mating dance between female and male seahorse. That results in females um, transmitting eggs through their ovipositor into the pouch of the male. The male then takes care of them, gestates them, and the babies then pop out later when they are fully formed and able to swim away. And this extreme fatherhood is characteristic of all of the seahorses, but it's also characteristic of the whole group of organisms, the whole group of fish that seahorses are related to. They're a bigger group that they're related to are the pipefish. Pipefish are like seahorses. If you just kind of take a look at the head end of a pipefish, you can see kind of a relationship between seahorses. But instead of the body being up and the animal swimming around vertically, they swim around more like eels do, but they're not eels at all. But they also, like seahorses, have a different kind of reproductive strategy in which the females transfer eggs to males. But unlike seahorses, there's a wide variety of different strategies there that show the evolutionary transition from a normal egg-laying strategy to this strategy of having male pouches with eggs inside. For the pipefish, they go through the same kind of mating interaction because they're more sinuous and eel-like. I mean, you see they can twine around together. And in pipefish, the females transfer their eggs to the male's ventral surface. And some males don't have anything on that ventral surface except that a place for the eggs to stick. Other males have a partial pouch there. Other males in different kinds of groups of pipefish have the pouch enclosing those eggs with placenta-like connections from the male's blood supply into where the eggs are being held to provide nutrients of those young. And then seahorse are like the final stage in which all of the males have eggs inside pouches and then take care of them that way. We can look at a phylogenetic tree of this group of fish, the synganids, and you can see that since about 50 million years ago, when the group first evolved, you have their ancestor, a pipefish that doesn't have a brood pouch. And then you see the evolution of greater and greater control by the male and care by the male of these eggs. Pipefish with a brood pouch, the ancestor to the seahorses themselves, and then the upright posture evolving with seahorses and their full brood, taking care of their full brood. So this particular strategy in seahorses isn't something that just popped up on the stage, has evolved over many tens of millions of years to provide greater and greater protection to those young for those species. But we can begin to ask other questions about the relationship between individuals and during the mating interactions. For example, does a male accept eggs from just one female? Does a male accept eggs from multiple females? And we can look at that by looking at the brooded eggs for, in this case, a set of pipefish and one species of seahorse, and look at the genetics of the individuals, the small embryos that are in those pouches, and simply ask, are they all full sibs? That is, do they share the same mother and father? Do they have the genes from the same two parents? Or is there evidence that, in fact, some of those offspring are eggs from different females? And if you sort of look at these different graphs here, the squares here represent different eggs within a particular pouch. The different sets of squares represent different individuals that are tested, and then the eggs that are all the same color and shading all come from the same female. And you can see in some species there's generally only one female that is adding eggs, because all of the eggs in the male's pouches all come from that female. They all have the same color. Whereas in other pipefish, there's a variety of different eggs from different females that are there. In this particular case, for these particular seahorses, each of these different individuals only had eggs from one female in his pouch, but other seahorses have more eggs from different females that are injected. In fact, for some seahorses, they are sometimes different broods that are at different levels or different levels of synchrony. They're not all starting at exactly the same time, particularly eggs that come from different females. So this just shows a kind of a typical relationship between brooding and paternity. It shows parental care. It shows a lot of the features that we tend to associate with, say, normal reproduction in birds or mammals. The flip side here is that it's the males that are providing this parental care and not the females. When we find other examples in ocean life of males that play a very different role in reproduction than we might think of for fish. And this is a fish called the midshipman. It's found on the west coast of the United States, shallow water, sometimes in the intertidal. And this particular fish has the one unique feature of actually calling for his mates. He sets up a territory under shallow rocks and then calls to bring females in to lay eggs in that particular nest. Now, like a lot of fish, individual females can come in, lay eggs from that particular male. Other females can come in later, so a male builds up a set of eggs that he's fertilized and he's taking care of, but they're from different females. The unique thing here is the display, that is the sound that this fish makes to bring in females and have them mate on his territory. And this is generally called lekking behavior. It's generally associated with terrestrial animals, birds in particular, some mammals. And where a male sets up a territory, the male displays himself or his territory to females. Females pick and choose among the males or the territory, places that they'll go, lay eggs, and have the male guard them and at least bring those eggs through part of the process. For these fish, like the midshipman or, say, damselfish, the male just guards the eggs until they hatch and the larvae swim away, but still provides a great deal of parental care and parental protection for that first phase of the eggs development. There's other fish that have taken this sort of display to remarkable levels. These strange wagon wheels in the sand were noticed off the coast of Japan, and they are actually a territory of a pufferfish that lives in that area. The pufferfish shown here makes this elaborate display, much bigger than the body of the pufferfish himself, as a mating display, as a lekking display for females to come in, mate with him, deposit eggs in the center, and then the male takes care of them there. These sorts of strategies for male attraction to females gives a lot of control for mating to the female to say which male will he actually, or which male will she actually mate with. And we see that playing out in other marine organisms as well. Humpback whales, for example, are well known on their mating grounds, which are usually in subtropical or tropical locations during the winter months. the males go through a long set of breaching and also singing as part of the way of attracting females in. We don't know an enormous amount about the exact role of that singing that humpback males do, how it attracts females, whether or not it's attracting females or just communicating among potential rival males. But we know that it's widespread across humpback whales. It's only really common on the mating grounds itself, and it plays some role in their social system and their social structure. Just by contrast, other whales like sperm whales have a very different social system. Pods of sperm whales tend to be just females and young. When you see groups of sperm whales in the ocean, it's generally just one sex and the young. Not just of the year, the young can be several years old. The males themselves, the bull males, are generally more solitary, roving around the ocean. Their social system is built around matrilines and the calves that they have. As females then grow up in that matriline, they stay with that group. Males, as they grow up, leave the group and start their wandering around the ocean. So all of these kinds of strategies for finding mates, getting together and producing young are a reflection of the diverse places and diverse ways that marine organisms live. And they work for those organisms, even though difference between whales is, it's difference between sperm whales and humpback whales is really a huge difference in how they are mating, yet it still works for those species. But we're going to basically take the next step and say, well, what are the reproductive strategies that are out there? And are there only just one reproductive strategy that works for a species? And what we'll find out is that some species have multiple reproductive strategies that work quite well. So in the first part of this lecture on the strangest family lives, I talked about different kinds of mating strategies in the ocean. And I didn't talk about all of the different strategies by any means. There's almost as many strategies as there are kinds of marine creatures. But in each case, we gave the idea that, well, a species has a strategy. But in fact, when you dig a little bit deeper, you find out that some species have multiple mating strategies that are going on all at the same time. So as an example, there's salmon. Pretty typically, salmon go upstream to spawn. In this case, you can see a large male salmon with sort of a hump back and a hooked lower beak. Those are features that the males begin to grow as they're moving upstream. Female, by contrast, doesn't have those features. And the typical male strategy is to get big, go upstream, establish a territory in a nice gravelly bed part of the stream, like a lek that we talked about before. The females are attracted to that male or the territory. They come in, spawn. Multiple females can come to that nest and spawn with that male. Both individuals then die, and the next generation starts. So that's the typical salmon spawning strategy. But there's another strategy that occurs in numerous salmon species, and those are called sneaker males. Sneaker males have a very different life. They basically are born in the same streams as regular large males, but instead of leaving that stream and going into the ocean at the end of the first summer, where those oceanic males spend a couple of years growing big and then come back, the sneaker males stay in the stream. They stay in the stream all fall and all winter and don't get very big. They maybe are getting to be 6, 8, 10 inches in length as opposed to the several feet in length that a big oceanic male salmon will grow to. Those sneaker males stay in the stream all winter and await the arrival of females and males for the next spawning season. Well, they've jumped generations a little bit because the animals that are coming back in that stream, the next spring are actually 2 or 3 years old. The sneaker males are only a year old, less than a year old. They're waiting there. They're small and they cannot establish a territory. They can't compete for the attention of females. Instead, they're called sneaker males because they tend to hang around the edges of the stream. And when a male establishes a territory and the females come along to spawn, they zoom in, throwing sperm everywhere they can in order to try to get some eggs fertilized before that big male chases them away. So those sneaker males come into the middle of a spawning aggregation, spawn, jet away, come back again. And their strategy is not to hold the territory and not to attract the mates, but essentially to parasitize the attraction and the territory that that big male set up and gain some spawning, gain some fertilizations on this other alternative mating strategy. Well, that's not the only species that has these alternative type of mating strategies, and people that have studied them in different sort of critters basically ask the same kind of question. Well, how successful is each of those strategies, and how can we tell how successful they really are? For example, in an isopod that lives inside sponges, there are in fact 3 different kinds of males that have 3 different types of morphologies. This male in the middle here is about the same size as the females. They mate together inside the sponges. And produce offspring. This male is much bigger, has these graspers that are used to grasp onto the female. They're much more aggressive than the medium-sized ones. And then there's the small males that play a similar role to the sneaker males. They're much smaller. They are not aggressive. They are not capable of dominating the reproductive interaction. Each of these 3 kinds of males actually is a very different mating strategy. And the question is what maintains that polymorphism in isopods, just like the same question is what maintains that polymorphism in salmon. So the way we tend to think about that is to ask, well, how well do these strategies work? Which one is more successful? If one strategy was really highly successful, much more than all the others, you'd expect natural selection to push towards that single best strategy. And that's probably why a lot of species only have one mating strategy, because natural selection has pushed towards the strategy that works the best in those species. Species that have a polymorphism, multiple mating strategies, we would predict each of these mating strategies would have to have about the same reproductive success, or natural selection would have eliminated the ones that have low reproductive success. So how do we actually measure reproductive success over the lifetime of an animal and try to use that to calculate the reproductive potential of each of these, say, different male strategies? So I want to go over basically how demographers calculate reproductive success over the life of an organism. And they start with a proportion of a cohort, that is the animals that were all born at the same time, the proportion of that cohort that survives over time. That's called the survivorship of the animals, and it's generally called that, we call that LX. It is the survivorship at age X is LX. Well, then in addition, there's the reproduction or the reproductive ability of that individual over time. That can change over time. Young organisms don't have very high reproductive ability. Other older organisms can have a much higher reproductive potential. And then when senescence sets in, the reproductive potential might drop. So the reproductive potential at any age is called MX. And LX times MX is the expected reproduction of an individual at age X. It takes the survival chance and the reproductive rate, puts them together, and that's the expected reproduction at age X for that organism. We take all of those LX, MX, and sum them up. The sum of LX and MX over all of the different ages is essentially the lifetime reproductive success that's expected of that organism with those kinds of life tables. So this shows a couple of different survivorship curves that we tend to find commonly in animals and plants. The type 1 survivorship curve is one where most individuals survive early on, and then their survival drops off with age. And this is typically the one we think of for mammals or other species that invest a lot in each offspring, so that they have a high survivorship to begin with, and then the survivorship drops off because of predation or age or other accidents. You can do the flip of this type 1 is type 3, and type 3 survivorship curves are the opposite in that lots of young are made. They don't have a very high survivorship on their own, and so their survivorship drops precipitously with age early on. But as they grow and get bigger and more mature, their survivorship gets better and better, and so this curve tends to flatten out. And you can think of this kind of survivorship for, say, a fish species that produces 300,000 eggs at a time. Each egg is really tiny, and the chance of that offspring surviving is really low, especially when they're quite young. But as the fish gets bigger, their survivorship chance gets higher and higher. So that means that initially the cohort drops in abundance and then flattens out. A type 2 curve is sort of somewhere in between, where organisms, when they're young, are basically pretty able to survive, but in fact, they have a constant rate of survival over time. Well, that's the survivorship curves. This is an LX curve, survivorship over age. Then we can basically look at a reproduction curve, and this is both an LX curve, which is the X, which is the black line here, and the reproductive curve for a set of insects feeding on wheat. Just as an example, we could use almost anything, but this happened to be a very clear one where you see the survivorship dropping over time, as we're expecting, and then the reproduction popping up, and then varying over time in a pretty complicated way, even over just the month or month and a half that these organisms live. So then if we want to ask what's the total expected reproductive success of this survival strategy and this reproductive strategy, we take all the points along this curve here, multiply them by that, and then add them all up. At the end, we get a relative number of the expected reproductive output of this particular set of species. So researchers have done that exact sort of calculation for the isopods that I was talking about. The alpha, beta, and gamma isopods are shown here. And then here we see the maturation rate, that is how fast they get to their final size, and then their reproductive tenure, that is how long they live. And the maturation rate is related to the survivorship curve, and then the reproductive tenure is related to the reproduction curve. So these are proxies for the survivorship and the reproduction curve. What you can see is that the alpha male takes it has a very low maturation rate. It takes a lot longer for these individuals to gain maturation age, whereas the gamma reproductive strategy gets there much more quickly. The rate of maturation is higher. Whereas the tenure, that is how long these particular males are able to reproduce, is much higher for the larger aggressive males than it is for the smaller ones. So this shows that the rate at which the males can achieve reproductive competence and the amount of time they can remain reproductive is exactly balanced one against the other. And when you begin to sum up the mean number of mates that each of these strategies can have over their mating period, that's shown in this particular graph, they're very similar to one another. It's a little bit lower, about 1.37 and 1.35 for the beta and the gamma reproductive strategies, and a little tiny bit higher, 1.5, for the large aggressive males. But they're basically pretty balanced against one another. And this is what one would predict. The survival of these different polymorphic phenotypes in a population is really only going to be a long-term strategy if each of these different males has a different potential, has a different strategy that works. Same is true of salmon and sneaker males. That sneaker males don't go out to sea. They have a much higher rate of survival than the males that do go out to sea, only a fraction of which come back. Once you take that into account, and then you take into account the fact that the males that do come back have a much higher rate of reproduction, then those two balance each other out almost exactly as well. So sneaker males' expected reproduction is about the same as the full oceanic males' expected reproduction. And that's what maintains that polymorphism in the population. Well, there's other ways of thinking about LX and MX. The example I showed was of MX dropping over time, but you can think about all kinds of different strategies that different marine organisms might have. Suppose, for example, MX increases over time because the animal gets bigger. We know that happens in fish. We know that happens in lots of colonial species. In that case, the expected reproductive output might favor organisms that have relatively low reproduction early and a lot more reproduction later when they're bigger. Conversely, if survivorship drops off very quickly with age, then it might be better to reproduce early. Well, it could be that in fact those calculations are different in different years in different places. And it's that difference from different times and different places that also can provide a different kind of polymorphism in populations, that every population of the same species might not be adapted to do exactly the same thing because they're living in different places and living at different times. So I've been talking about mating strategies and talking about different strategies in males and females. But maybe we should dig into a little bit about why there are males and females. What about animal reproduction, even plant reproduction, has led to these differences that we call female reproductive strategies and male reproductive strategies? Fundamentally, we're talking about male reproductive strategies as individuals that produce small gametes, sperm or pollen, and individuals that produce large gametes like eggs for animals or for plants. And that is a common way that individuals in terrestrial and oceanic environments reproduce. Even single-celled organisms can produce gametes that are small or big. But how did that evolve, and why is it so ubiquitous? Now, it didn't evolve. I mean, it is not completely ubiquitous. There are still plenty of individuals, generally single-celled organisms, that don't make eggs and sperm, but they do create gametes that are different mating types. And it takes the union of two different mating types coming together to make a zygote that then makes the next generation. So these gametes are the same size. They're isogamous. They're the same size gametes. But then after that came very quickly the evolution of similar kinds of organisms that produce different sized gametes. The large ones we call eggs, the small ones we call sperm, and that's referred to as anisogamy, which evolved in eukaryotes 2 to 3 billion years ago and is the dominant feature for reproduction in multicellular animals and plants. But why? Why is that different sized gametes have evolved and are so common? We can think about it in terms of the role that gamete size plays in actually the survival of the zygote. And a general rule of thumb is that a larger zygote has a little bit better chance of survival, perhaps. And so making larger gametes is beneficial. But if you have only a certain amount of energy to put into reproduction, then you can take that energy and you can put it into a few large gametes, or you could put it into many smaller gametes. So there's a flip side to that selection for large gametes, that there's also selection for smaller gametes because you can make more of them. And that dual selection, yes, there are circumstances in which it's better to make big gametes, and then there's circumstances under which it's better to make many small gametes. That dual selection playing out leads to polymorphism within a species to make some individuals making big gametes and some individuals making small gametes. It's the fusion of those two that creates zygotes. And so the balancing act that selection has is that you have to have both kinds of gametes in order to make a zygote. Because of that, then the pressure to have both kinds persists in populations. How does that work out just in terms of the evolutionary process? You can imagine mutations to make slightly larger gametes sweep through a population if making larger gametes then provides your offspring with a higher level of reproductive success. That is a higher level of survivorship. But on the other hand, a mutation that actually produces small gametes, say in a different line of that same group of single-celled organisms, that mutation to make small gametes also is successful because you can make more gametes and there's more chance that those gametes will fertilize or fuse with others. So each of those mutations has some selective advantage, and because of that, they're both produced in populations and then persist over time. So at the end of this process, we have individuals of a species that produce large gametes, individuals of the same species that produce small gametes, and we call them males and females because they make eggs and sperm. But what's the right ratio of males and females? What's the right sex ratio in a species? One way of thinking about it would be, well, it doesn't take too many males to produce lots of sperm. And so there could be a lot fewer males than females because after all, then you get more offspring produced because there's more eggs in the population. And then they all get fertilized because the males are producing lots of sperm. So why doesn't selection lead to high ratios of females to males in populations? And that puzzled people for a long time until the idea came out that, well, actually, every organism, every zygote in that species has a mother and a father. That is, every zygote has a parent that produced a large gamete and a parent that produced a small gamete too. So the reproductive success of small and large gamete parents is exactly the same because all individuals then came from those kinds of matings. So if in fact there were fewer males in the population making lots of sperm, then it would be more advantageous for you to be a male because you'd have access to a lot more fertilizations. If there were in fact way more males than females in the population, then it would be better for you to be a female because those eggs would be then the limiting resource in reproduction for the next generation. So it's that balancing act between whether it's better to be a male or female really boils down to it's always better to be the sex that has fewer individuals in the population because it takes both sexes to make every zygote. It's that balancing act that tends to lead to the sex ratios in populations being about 50-50 at birth. Well, why have males at all is another question that pops up because after all, if a population is only females, then it has a lot higher growth potential. All the individuals are making eggs. All the individuals would be then making offspring. And so say you've got birds that are all female, they're all laying 2 eggs every summer, as opposed to a population where half are female and half male. And you only got half the reproduction because only half the individuals are laying eggs. You would think, well, the population that has twice the number of egg-laying individuals will grow faster and outcompete the population that has relatively fewer egg-laying individuals. Why doesn't that play out? Well, part of the answer is that in order to make, say, species that have no males at all, has evolved several times and many times in the history of life. It is essentially then females creating parthenogenic offspring, that is, eggs that are exactly the same genetically as them. Then those eggs develop into juveniles and then adults, which are exactly the same genetically as their mothers. And these clones then can spread over the landscape. They're all genetically identical, however, and because of that, they have very little potential to evolve under changes in environmental conditions from time to time or space or place to place. So as a consequence, we know that there are some cases like that that have evolved. Clonal lizards, there's clonal Daphnia, there's some clonal bivalves, but by and large, those lines tend not to persist very long in the fossil record. There are some intriguing exceptions, particularly with some parthenogenic clonal bivalves that seem to last a long time in the fossil record, but what we don't know about that is how quickly the clones turn over, how quickly a particular clone grows and is successful and dies out. So we know that animals can produce genetically identical offspring that don't need any males. They can produce parthenogenetic offspring, where the diploid nucleus is exactly the same as the nucleus that female has. So she's producing a whole next generation that's genetically identical to her. Parthenogenetic lizards, for example, are pretty well known in the central United States, but they don't tend to last for a long time. Those lineages have a fossil record that only goes back tens of thousands of years. So it seems like those lines can be successful, but they tend to die out. There's some exceptions. We know there's some bivalves that make parthenogenetic eggs that do last a long time, but what we don't know about them is whether clones of those bivalves are successful, grow up, and then die back. And that is what the evolutionary dynamic seems to be, that individuals that are parthenogenetic are all genetically the same. They have no evolutionary potential, but if they're the right genome, the right adaptations at the right time, they might take off and grow quite wildly because they have such a large demographic potential. But as the environment changes over time or space, perhaps that one kind of genome, that one kind of adaptation isn't successful and it can die out. The other thing that happens with those kinds of lines is that they're picking up deleterious mutations all the time. They have no way to get rid of them, and so eventually they have a huge genetic load that they can't deal with. That points to the evolutionary advantage of organisms having both male and female parents for their offspring. Their offspring are genetically more diverse because of it, but also the process of meiosis that produces haploid gametes from diploid cells. That meiosis process is when recombination happens. And that's when different parts of a genome are spliced together in different ways. And that also adds to the evolutionary potential of organisms, of offspring that are produced through normal sexual means. So even though all species have males, or most species have males, it doesn't mean that they're always obvious or that they don't have different kinds of strategies. Anglerfish, for example, were once long thought to be a whole group of fish that only had females because all of the anglerfish that were brought up, they're all deep sea animals, that all that were brought up in dredges and trawls were females. And so for a long time, it wasn't clear where the males were, if there were any males at all in this species. But then parasitologists began to notice these parasites that were living on top of females, particularly on their ventral surface, and this is the male. Males are small. They never get to be bigger than just, fractions of an inch. And when a male anglerfish is in its larval phase in the deep sea, it's dark, it's cold, and they actually find a female of their species much bigger than them, they will grab hold, bite onto that female, and then hang on there forever for the rest of their lives. First, their jaws just dissolve into the flesh of the females, and then slowly their brain deteriorates, they lose all their nervous system, they lose all their guts, their blood supply fuses with the female, and over time they essentially become just a testis that is sitting on the outside of the female that she uses to fertilize her eggs. So in this species, there are males, and they're always there fertilizing the eggs of every female so that all those eggs have a father, but you can't find males in the environment. They play no ecological role whatsoever. There's still one other different kind of strategy that's pretty common in the ocean that is in the dynamics between males and females. And that's where individuals might start out at one sex, one be starting out as female or starting out as male, but then change sex over time. And that's exemplified in the ocean by wrasses, for example. And here, these large individuals, bright blue heads, um, are common on reef around the Caribbean, and they're always associated with these smaller fish, yellow and black and white striped small fish that hang out around them. Well, it turns out that they're all the same species, and that the large blue-headed fish are males. They have harems of many smaller yellow fish, the females, and every day they spawn together, the large male fertilizing all the eggs of the harem females. The females produce large numbers of eggs. They grow, but they don't actually turn into males until the social signal is right to do that. And that signal is if this male is taken away from the harem. If that happens because a predator picks him off, or maybe a curious experimental marine biologist wants to see what happens when you pull the male away, then the largest female in the harem very quickly starts acting like a male. Within days, she changes her color to male coloration. She begins to grow, and within a few weeks, she's actually producing sperm instead of eggs. So the largest female in the harem takes up the social structure, the social status of that large male in the harem, and the whole set of individuals then goes back to reproducing. So in this species, every individual starts off as a small female and then has the potential for becoming a large male if the social conditions allow it. Other marine species do exactly the opposite. Grass shrimp, for example, and some other kinds of crustaceans, they all start out as male. Males can fertilize many eggs, and in this particular species, the eggs are brooded on a brood pouch under the abdomen. So larger individuals can have many more eggs than smaller individuals, and in this particular case, it's advantageous for these species to start off as males. All the individuals do, and as they grow, they molt eventually into becoming females. So that sex change is the opposite from the wrasses. And the notion here is that the difference here is that male wrasses compete for territories, and they compete for harems, and so being big as a male is beneficial in that particular setting, but being small as a male and being big as a female is beneficial in this other setting. Well, perhaps the best known of the sex-changing fish are the clownfish. And in this particular case, the life cycle is more like the grass shrimp than it is like the wrasses. Individuals in an anemone, all of the same species, generally have one large individual, which is a reproductive female, and the next biggest individual in that anemone is the reproductive male. They mate, she lays eggs, and the offspring disperse. There could be many other individuals of that same species living in that anemone smaller than the male, and they're all essentially in line. They're not reproductive at all. They're small, too small to reproduce. But if a predator comes in, takes the female out of the anemone, well, then the reproductive male grows in to that role and starts producing eggs, grows up into the role of reproductive female. The next largest of the small juveniles who weren't reproductive at all before then takes over the role of the reproductive male. In this case, there's always just one male and one female reproducing on the anemone, but there's an entire group of individuals there that can replace them over time. Those individuals aren't necessarily all tightly related because they came in as larvae from other places, but nevertheless they form this hierarchy of reproduction over time.